Hi, my name is Jeremiah DeGennaro. I'm the site manager at Alamance Battleground State Historic Site in Burlington, North Carolina. Today I'm in Hillsborough, where exactly 250 years ago, a large group of people who were associated together under the name Regulators descended upon this town and committed what came to be known as the Hillsborough Riot. This action was centered around the meeting of the District Superior Court and became one of the largest causes of the military campaign that was organized in the spring of 1771 to crush the Regulator movement. Today, I'm going to be talking about the events of the Hillsborough Riot, who was involved, what led to the riot, and how the riot affected the future of the Regulator movement in 1770 and 1771. I'd like you to join me as we walk around Hillsborough and we stop at some of the sites where history actually happened 250 years ago today. The events of the Hillsborough Riot centered around the meeting of the Hillsborough District Superior Court, which met close to this spot near the center of downtown Hillsborough, close to the intersection of King and Churton Streets. I'm standing in front of the old Orange County Courthouse, which was actually built in the 19th century, many decades after the events here took place in 1770. However, the old Orange County Courthouse is built just behind the location of the 18th century courthouse where the Regulators had their riot and where the September 1770 District Superior Court had their meeting. The reason why the Hillsborough Riot took place while the court was in session is because the Superior Court was a very important source of Regulator grievances during this time. Local farmers felt that they could not get impartial juries or fair trials at the court, and Regulators had had a very bad session of court in the spring session in March of 1770. Several farmers had brought suit against many local officials charging extortion. However, in that March 1770 court session, all of the defendants were able to successfully defend themselves against these lawsuits. And in fact, one local official, Edmund Fanning, was able to countersue two of his accusers for slander, and he was successful in that suit. Also, Regulator leader Herman Husband had a judgment against him in March of 1770 to the amount of 375 pounds. Husband later called the Superior Court, quote, the horn of the beast, and the Regulators decided that if they could not get fair trials at court, they would have to find justice some other way. The fall session of the Hillsborough Superior Court was presided over by Judge Richard Henderson, and he opened the court on Saturday, September 22nd. On that Saturday, there was not much business to be done. He did hold naturalizations for two new British citizens, and as soon as court opened up, Regulator leader James Hunter approached Richard Henderson with a petition from the Regulators that served as a final opportunity for the Regulators to air their grievances, ask for redress, and to give a warning of sorts if Richard Henderson would not listen to them. In the Regulator petition, it was noted that the Regulators could not get impartial juries, and they sought to have new juries placed for all of the cases that were going to be tried during the session. They also noted, to sum up the whole matter of our petition in a few words, it is namely these: that we may obtain unprejudiced juries, that all extortionate officers, lawyers, and clerks may be brought to fair trials, that the collectors of public money may be called to proper settlement of their accounts. At the end of this petition, the Regulators also gave a stern warning to Richard Henderson about what would happen if they were not listened to. If we cannot obtain this, that we may have some security for our properties more than the bare humor of offers, we can see plainly that we shall not be able to live under such oppressions, and to what extremities this must drive us, you can as well judge of as we can ourselves. Upon receiving the Regulators' petition, Judge Richard Henderson realized that he did not have enough time to give a formal response, and so he adjourned the court deciding that he would give a formal response to the regulators on the next day that court was in session on Monday, September 24th. When court reopened on Monday, September 24th, the town of Hillsborough was quiet, albeit busy. Whenever Superior Court was in session, because so many people from around the county had to come into Hillsborough with business before the court, the town was abuzz with activity, with extra people, an expanded population, merchants, and a market set up to help sell wares to all of these newcomers into the town of Hillsborough, farmers bringing their crops to market. It really was a very active place on court days. And so when the court session opened, it was a flurry of activity, but there was no indication that anything was going to go wrong. However, that quickly changed according to Richard Henderson's account. As soon as court was opened, the regulators who had their leaders James Hunter and Jeremiah Fields with them entered the courtroom and began talking with Richard Henderson, who remembers the proceedings this way. At about 11 o'clock, the court was opened, and immediately the house filled as close as one man could stand by another, some with clubs, others with whips and switches, few or none without some weapon. When the house had become so crowded that no more could well get in, one of them, whose name I think is called Fields, came forward and told me he had something to say before I proceeded to business. The accounts I had previously received, together with the manner and appearance of these men and the abruptness of their address, rendered my situation extremely uneasy. Upon my informing Fields that he might speak on, he proceeded to let me know that he spoke for the whole body of the people called Regulators, that they understood that I would not try their causes, and their determination was to have them tried, for they had come down to see justice done, and justice they would have. And if I would proceed to try those causes, it might prevent much mischief. With the courthouse packed full of people, most of them armed, Richard Henderson found himself in a very precarious position, and so he found himself trying to talk down the regulators and trying to ease the tensions of the people in the group who were so intent on seeing justice done that day. And so over the course of a half hour, he went back and forth with James Hunter, with Jeremiah Fields, and however, he was not able to make any headway with the regulators until eventually many of the people in the courthouse started to shout, "Retire, retire, let the court go on." And they left the courtroom and went outside. As the regulators were standing outside discussing what their next course of action would be, the spark that would ignite the powder keg of the Regulator riots walked past them in the form of Attorney John Williams. Now, Williams was an attorney and an official of the court. He was already not well liked by the regulators by virtue of his being a lawyer. However, he also had signed an arrest warrant for one of the regulator leaders, Herman Husband, only a few years prior. And so regulators did not see him very fondly, and as soon as Williams walked past them, some members of the regulator crowd accosted him. Richard Henderson has this to say about what took place next. The little hopes of peace derived from this piece of behavior were very transient, for in a few minutes, Mr. Williams, an attorney of that court, was coming in and had advanced near the door when they fell on him in a most furious manner with clubs and sticks of enormous size, and it was with great difficulty he saved his life by taking shelter in a neighboring storehouse. After John Williams was beaten in front of the courthouse, any amount of restraint that the regulators might have had went out the window and the riot was on. Many regulators went back into the courthouse and began dragging officials of the court outside to receive the same punishment that John Williams did. One of the men who was targeted by the regulators was a man named Edmund Fanning. Fanning was a large land speculator in Orange County. He was one of the wealthiest citizens in Hillsborough. He enjoyed the privilege of several different positions in the county and the colonial government, and he was one of the most despised people by the Regulators. They found him in the courthouse. He retired to the back portion of the courtroom and stood up on the judge's bench, it being the highest point in the room, to try and mount some kind of defense, but he was pulled out of the courtroom. Richard Henderson has this to say about how Fanning was treated by the Regulators. Mr. Fanning was next the object of their fury. Him they seized and took with a degree of violence not to be described from off the bench where he had retired for protection and assistance, and with hideous shouts of barbarian cruelty dragged him by the heels out of doors, while others engaged in dealing out blows with such violence that I made no doubt his life would instantly become a sacrifice to their rage and madness. One of the other accounts of the Hillsborough Riot actually comes from a newspaper article printed in the Virginia Gazette out of Williamsburg, Virginia, which carried a very long, very exacting detail of the events of the Hillsborough Riot. And this is what it has to say about what happened to Fanning that day. They then entered the courthouse and immediately fixed their attention on Colonel Fanning as the next object of their merciless cruelty. They seized him by the neck, dragged him down the steps, his head striking violently on every step, carried him to the door, and forcing him out, dragged him on the ground over stones and brickbats, struck him with their whips and clubs, kicked him, spit and spurned at him, and treated him with every possible mark of contempt and cruelty. Edmund Fanning was actually able to get away from the mob that was beating him up just outside of the courthouse. Accounts do differ about what happens to him immediately afterward. Some say that he takes shelter in a store, and others say that he's given the opportunity by the Regulators to leave town with his life so long as he promised not to come back. Richard Henderson continues to hold court, and we actually have a very interesting document from that court session, which I went to take a look at in Raleigh at the State Archives. Okay, I am in the reading room of the State Archives of North Carolina in downtown Raleigh, and I've got a very special document that we're going to take a closer look at today. This was something that we were hoping to actually take out into the community and bring back to Hillsborough in conjunction with the anniversary of the Hillsborough Riot 250 years ago. But because of our social distancing restrictions, we're going to have to do this here at the archives, but we are going to have a way to take a closer look at it and really see just how interesting this document is. So just to kind of set the stage, after the Regulators have broken into the courtroom, they've beaten up lawyers, Edmund Fanning has been dragged out of the building, there's one official of the court who is left, Richard Henderson, and he is an associate judge on the Superior Court. He's the only judge that is presiding on this day, and he obviously is very fearful as other officials of the court are being attacked, beaten up within an inch of their lives. He feels that he is probably going to be next, and he is apparently comforted by Regulator leaders like Jeremiah Fields and James Hunter, who say that they do not have any plans to hurt him. They don't have any quarrel with him specifically, even though there are some Regulators who do not like Henderson because he does not try Regulator cases. He is no friend to the Regulators, and they do intimidate him by saying that he's going to be next. The leaders of the movement say, we're not going to hurt you. There's no fear that you should have of bodily injury so long as you continue to do your job and you hold court. But they want to hold court in a very specific way. They want to have it done to the standards of the Regulators. And there are a couple of things that they ask for court to be able to continue. So the big thing that the regulators are upset about around Superior Court is the juries. And so they want all of the juries that have been selected to be thrown out. They want to be able to try their cases in front of their own people. They also don't have much affection for lawyers. And so they also stipulate that no attorney is to be allowed into the courtroom while the court is in session. And so the court cases that do go on over the next 4 or 5 hours, in Henderson's mind, don't really have much legitimacy, but he does press on in order to try to placate the regulators enough to save bloodshed and to try to stem this riot and to keep the tempers of the regulators down. So he continues, and in the 18th century, as in today, there is a court docket, and you keep records of who has court cases and how those cases are decided. And right here I have the court docket that was in the courthouse at Hillsborough during the riot in September of 1770. And what's interesting about this docket is that you can see exactly when the riot starts, and that is because when the regulators start to hold their cases under their own terms, there are actually marks and comments in the margins that are written from the regulator perspective. So let's take a closer look at these comments and see how we can tell that it's written by the regulators. So here's a better view of the docket itself, and we're going to be sharing a link to the digitized version of the docket so that you can take a closer look and really zoom in on some of these comments if you want to take a turn reading all through them. But I did want to highlight a couple of the interesting ones that are here in a note on a case that are talking about taxes and fees that have to be paid to Johnston and Thaxton, who own a store in Hillsborough. The comment is anything for money. And as we scroll up, you can really see just how different these comments in the margins are. Over here, you've got this very nice handwriting that is written for the docket before the court starts and before the riot interrupts the court. And here we have this darker ink. You can see handwriting that is perfectly legible, but that is just written a little bit more haphazardly. And you have comments about the cases themselves, judgment by default, but then you have very interesting editorialized comments. Damned roguery. And this is something that the regulators talk about a lot, roguery, misdeeds, malfeasance. And here in the comments, we have plaintiff pays all, gets his body scourged for blasphemy. That's not the typical type of comment that you would see in a court docket, so that is certainly written by regulators while the riot is going on, while they have taken over the court. I'm going to continue on. And you can, the ink is so thick in these pages that you can actually see it bleeding through on the other side, which you don't see on the other comments that were written previously into the docket before court started. Now here is a great page. We have comments on the rulings between the court case of Thomas Trammell and William Dunnigan. Dunnigan pays. And then in the case of Philip Edwards and John Edwards, the findings of the court, the editorialized comments, damned shame. And in the other court case just above it, this is really cool, between Michael Wilson and David Harris, all Harrises are rogues. Tyree Harris was a big official in Orange County who was a sheriff and was very much despised by the regulators. Now, in this one, Ezekiel Brumfield versus James Farrell. Farrell had actually just passed away, and so
he was not there for the courthouse, for the court case. And the way that's written by the regulators, nonsense. Let them agree, for Farrell has gone hellward. Sort of celebrating the death of James Farrell. Again, Isaiah Hogan and Herman Husband, regulator leader, Hogan pays and be damned. And so we see some very interesting comments that are written here.
After Richard Henderson held court for the regulators for those 4 to 5 hours, he was then escorted back to his house and was told that he could not leave the town, and it was expected of him to continue holding court the next day. However, in the middle of the night, he is able to find an opportunity to escape from his home and to leave Hillsborough. And with that, the regulators are completely in charge of the town. And it's at this point where they had been beating up the people that they had issues with, but it's important to note that most of those people did live in Hillsborough and their homes were here. And at this point, many of the regulators begin targeting the property of Hillsborough's elite. And again, the person who comes in for the strongest reaction from the regulators is Edmund Fanning. The regulators go to his house and take matters into their own hands in taking his property and destroying the goods that he owns. According to Richard Henderson's account, the regulators went as a group to this spot, what's now the Masonic Hall in downtown Hillsborough, and what once was the site of the home of Edmund Fanning. Once here, they targeted the property of Edmund Fanning and exacted their revenge on him through the destruction of his home. The Virginia Gazette article detailing the Hillsborough riot had this to say about what the regulators did to Fanning's home. They marched in a body to Colonel Fanning's house, and on a signal given by their ringleaders, entered the same, destroyed every piece of furniture in it, ripped open his beds, broke and threw in the streets every piece of china and glassware in the house, scattered all his papers and books in the winds, seized all his plate, cash, and proclamation money, entered his cellars, and after satiating and gorging their more than savage stomachs with his liquors, stove and threw in the streets the remainder. Being now drunk with rage, liquor, and lawless fury, they took his wearing clothes, struck them on a pole, paraded them in triumph through the streets, and, to close the scene, pulled down and laid his house in ruins. According to Richard Henderson's account, Mr. Fanning's house is not quite down. A few timbers support the lower story, but they are cut off at the sills, and a small breeze of wind will throw down the little that remains. After the destruction of Edmund Fanning's home, with no Hillsborough elite left in town and property damage already done, the regulators found that their riot had run out of steam, and they left town the evening of Wednesday, September 25th. The regulators left the residents of Hillsborough to pick up the pieces, with Richard Henderson noting, "The insurgents left the town on Wednesday night, having done very little mischief after spoiling Mr. Fanning's house, except breaking the windows of most of the houses in town. The merchants and others are taking possession of their shattered tenements." With the regulators gone from Hillsborough and the town beginning to pick up the pieces, all that was left was to notify authorities in the colonial capital of New Bern about what had happened. As soon as Governor Tryon received Richard Henderson's letter at his home in New Bern, he read it and became furious. He was incredibly incensed to read of the events that took place here in Hillsborough during the riot, and immediately called together his council and consulted the Attorney General, looking for things that he could do to put down the regulator movement for once and for all. The Attorney General recommended to Tryon that he work with the Assembly to pass a piece of legislation that would give him the authority to use force against the regulators and would also adequately make the Hillsborough riot an action that was unlawful and which would allow the governor to prosecute the participants in the riot for breaking the law. The law that Governor Tryon and the Assembly came up with came to be known as the Johnston Riot Act, named after its author, Samuel Johnston. This Riot Act provided for several different provisions that Governor Tryon used in his action against the regulators going forward. The first thing that it did was prohibit any unlawful assemblies of 10 or more people, and if those assemblies were found to be taking place, people in unlawful assembly could be given a warning of 1 hour, given a warning to disperse, and if they did not disperse, deadly force could be used against them. The Johnston Riot Act also allowed for provisions to be made to raise the militia of North Carolina to march against the regulators, and this law was passed retroactively, making sure that all of the participants in Hillsborough would be found to have broken the law and would be considered outlaws at the time. With the Johnston Riot Act in hand, Governor Tryon formed his militia in the spring of 1771 and marched west into the backcountry to confront the regulators. That confrontation took place west of Hillsborough near Alamance Creek in modern-day Alamance County. And when the forces of Governor Tryon and a large group of about 2,000 regulators found each other on opposite sides of the battlefield, Governor Tryon sent emissaries to the regulators to read portions of the Johnston Riot Act and ask the regulators to disperse. However, when they were given the opportunity to disperse, the regulators instead shouted, "Battle, battle," or "Fire and be damned." Egging on the militia, Governor Tryon obliged the regulators and commenced the battle. What ensued was a 2-hour-long battle involving 3,000 people, 8 artillery pieces, and at the end of which the regulators were unable to beat the organization and the superior firepower of Governor Tryon's militia, and they were scattered to the 4 winds. Governor Tryon continued after the battle to march through the backcountry into the regulator settlements, where he destroyed the homes of regulator leaders, and he made his camp available for regulators to come in and sign oaths of allegiance, promising that they would never take up arms against the government again, surrendering up any firearms that they might have had, and promising to pay any possibly unpaid taxes that they might owe. With these oaths of allegiance taken over the course of a few weeks in late May and early June, Governor Tryon returned to Hillsborough, the scene of the riot, in September of 1770, and it was here, on this very spot, where Governor Tryon held the executions of 6 regulator leaders who were all found guilty of treason based on their breaking the Johnston Riot Act and their participation in the Battle of Alamance. It was on this spot, just east of the town of Hillsborough, on the road to Halifax, that Governor Tryon ordered the executions to take place. He chose this spot, ordered the woods on this hillside to be cleared and gallows constructed, and 6 regulators, including Enoch Pugh, Robert Mattier, Robert Messer, and Captain Benjamin Merrill, were given the sentence of death and had their execution carried out by hanging. And so it was that Hillsborough was able to witness both the beginning of the regulator crisis in September of 1770 and the end of the regulator movement in June of 1771. I'd like to thank you for joining me on this walking tour of historic Hillsborough and the sites of the Regulator Riot of September 1770, 250 years ago today, and of the events of the regulator hangings on June 19th of 1771. For those of you who would like to walk around town in Hillsborough, please contact the Alliance for Historic Hillsborough and take part in one of their many guided tours that they usually offer. And If you're interested in learning more about the Regulator movement in general or the Battle of Alamance in particular, please consider visiting us at Alamance Battleground State Historic Site in Burlington, and consider taking our virtual guided tour of the Regulator Riot sites that we have hosted on Vamonde.com. Thank you so much for visiting Historic Hillsborough virtually, and we hope to see you again soon at Alamance Battleground and here in Historic Hillsborough.